Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at indicative conditionals.
Oh, yeah.
And, as a philosopher, this is something you know all about,
Right.
these if-then statements
hmm
that we use every day.
Yeah.
But we're really going to try to unpack
Okay.
how these things actually work.
Yeah.
And luckily, we have the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy
Yeah.
to help us along the way.
Awesome.
And we also have expert speaker.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to sort of unpack some of these ideas.
Yeah, these are really interesting, fundamental parts of our language.
Oh, absolutely.
And they lead to some pretty thorny philosophical debates.
I mean, it seems so simple on the surface, right?
Right.
If I miss the bus, then I'll be late for work.
Yeah, exactly.
That's easy.
You got it.
But then
Yeah.
what makes it true? What makes it false?
Right.
And what can we conclude from it?
Totally. And those are the questions that we're going to dig into today. So before we get started, I think it's important to distinguish indicative conditionals from their close relatives.
Okay.
The subjunctive or counterfactual conditionals.
Oh.
So indicatives are about possibility in the actual world, like the bus example.
Right.
Counterfactuals explore what would be the case
Okay.
if something different had happened.
Ah.
Like if I had studied philosophy in college then.
Okay.
So we could do a whole other deep dive on that.
We'll save that for another day.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so today we're sticking with the indicative kind.
Yep.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia really lays out
Okay.
what the sort of central puzzle is here.
Okay.
How do we know when an if-then statement is acceptable?
Mhm.
What follows from it?
Okay.
And why is this construction so crucial
Right.
to how we think and how we argue?
Absolutely. So let's start with one of the classic accounts,
Okay.
the truth functional account.
Right.
So this account says that the truth of a conditional is determined only by the truth or falsity of its parts.
Okay.
You'll find this in pretty much any intro logic textbook.
Right.
It's often based on the idea of material implication.
Oh, yeah, I remember
Yeah.
material implication from my intro logic class.
Yeah,
That was,
it's a bit tricky.
it's a little bit odd.
Yeah.
So just to refresh everyone,
Yeah.
if A, then B is only false when A is true and B is false.
That's right.
And true in all other cases,
Yeah.
even back then.
Right.
That seemed a little bit odd to me.
Well, it leads to some pretty weird results.
Okay.
Like, for example,
Mhm.
the truth functional account says that a conditional with a false antecedent is automatically true.
So, if the moon is made of cheese, then I'm a king
That's a good one, yeah.
is true.
Yes.
Because the moon is not made of cheese.
Right. And it feels strange to say that that statement is true
It does.
because there's no real connection between the if part and the then part.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia uses another example.
Right.
If I'm recording this podcast, then the earth is round,
Right.
which is definitely true
Yeah.
because the consequent is true.
Yeah.
But again,
Yeah.
something's missing.
Totally. Yeah.
There's no real connection between those two.
It seems like our everyday use of conditionals hinges on more than just
Right.
the possibility of the antecedent being false.
Right.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia does give a pretty compelling argument
Okay.
in favor of the truth functional account.
Okay.
So imagine you have a bag with two balls
Okay.
and you're told at least one is red.
Okay.
You can confidently say,
Okay.
if this ball isn't red, then the other one is.
Yeah.
And your confidence in that
Yeah.
seems to stem from the limited possibilities about
Alright.
the balls,
Okay.
which kind of supports a truth functional analysis.
That's the red ball argument.
Exactly.
And that's always a tricky one.
Yeah. But those other cases are still a little bit strange.
Yeah, they're still weird.
And especially when we factor in uncertainty.
Right. Because on the truth functional account, any conditional with an unlikely antecedent would have to be highly probable.
Right.
So if I win the lottery, I'll donate $1 million to charity.
Yeah.
That's probably true,
Probably.
according to the truth functional account,
Right.
because I'm probably not going to win the lottery.
Right.
But that's not really how we think about that.
It seems like it should depend on something more
Yeah,
than just the odds of winning.
right.
So that's one of the big challenges.
Yeah.
The truth functional view.
So where do we go from here?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia points us in the direction of a philosopher named H.P. Grice
Okay.
and his pragmatic defense of the truth functional account.
So is he saying that the paradoxes aren't really about the logic?
Yeah, that's kind of the idea.
Okay.
He says that sometimes we say things that are technically true,
Okay.
but misleading
Okay.
because of conversational norms.
Okay.
So, for example, if I say,
Yeah.
John is either at the pub or the library,
Right.
When I know he's at the pub,
Right.
I'm not lying,
Right.
but I'm being intentionally vague.
So maybe when I say, if the moon is made of cheese, then I'm a king,
Yeah.
I'm not really committed to the truth of that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just being silly.
Yeah, it could be a joke.
Right.
So Grice's analysis works pretty well for some cases like disjunctions,
Okay.
but the Stanford Encyclopedia argues that it's less convincing
Okay.
when it comes to conditionals,
Mm.
especially when we consider our beliefs about them.
Okay.
So it seems like I can genuinely disbelieve that if the moon is made of cheese, then I'm a king, even if I understand that it's technically true on the truth functional account.
Right. It doesn't feel like a joke.
Right.
I really don't believe that.
Exactly.
And it's not just about those weird cases.
Right.
It seems like Grice's approach also doesn't really work when we're talking about conditionals that we use for planning or for making decisions.
Like,
If I get this promotion, then I'll buy a house. I don't accept that just because I think the promotion is unlikely.
yeah, you're thinking about what would happen
Right.
if you actually got the promotion.
Yeah, so it seems like our understanding of conditionals
Right.
goes beyond just like assigning truth values
Yeah.
based on the parts.
We need to consider how we reason about these hypothetical situations.
Okay.
And this brings us to another family of theories
Right.
called suppositional theories.
Let's get suppositional.
Okay, so the suppositional view
Okay.
says that judging a conditional, if A then B,
Okay.
it's not about assigning a truth value to the whole thing.
Okay.
It's more about a thought experiment.
Okay.
It's about adding A to your set of beliefs
Okay.
as if it were true, and then seeing what you would conclude about B.
So it's not really about whether the whole conditional is true or false.
Right.
It's more about
Yeah.
like how our beliefs about B change when we assume A.
Exactly. And this connects really nicely
Yeah.
to the concept of conditional probability. Okay. Which measures the degree to which you believe B,
Okay.
given the assumption that A is true.
Okay, so we're talking about degrees of belief here.
Right.
We're not just talking about true or false,
Not just black and white.
which seems to make more sense
Yeah.
in most cases.
It's how we use conditionals every day.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, we're never really 100% certain about anything.
Right. And the Stanford Encyclopedia ties this back to Frank Ramsey,
Okay.
who suggested that when we're considering a conditional,
Okay.
we're basically fixing our degrees of belief in
Yeah.
the consequent given the antecedent.
So like when I say,
Yeah.
if I practice every day, then I'll probably improve at playing the piano.
Okay.
That's not
Right.
kind of absolute truth. It's about,
Yeah.
you know, my degree of belief in improving,
Exactly.
given that I practice every day.
And that can fluctuate based on all sorts of things.
Right.
Like your past experience.
Right, exactly.
How much effort you put in
Yeah.
all of that.
Okay, so that's interesting.
And this leads to a really interesting reinterpretation of validity when
Yeah.
it comes to arguments.
Okay.
So Ernest Adams,
Okay.
who developed the suppositional theory,
Okay.
he argued that a valid argument
Okay.
is one that preserves probability.
Wait, so instead of saying
Yeah.
a valid argument guarantees a true conclusion if the premises are true,
Right.
we're now saying it's about
Yeah.
how the probabilities of the premises
Mm-hmm.
affect the probability of the conclusion.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's like this bridge
Okay.
that carries the weight of your beliefs
Yeah.
and the premises to the conclusion.
Okay.
So a valid argument makes sure that if
Really?
your initial beliefs are highly probable,
Okay.
then your conclusion will be highly probable as well.
Interesting.
And Adams showed that those classically valid arguments,
Okay.
the ones that preserve truth,
Uh,
they also have this property of preserving probability.
okay.
And he extended this idea to arguments that involve conditionals.
So even when we're dealing with uncertainty,
Yeah.
deductive reasoning is still a reliable guide,
It is.
which is nice.
But here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
Adams argued that some of those argument forms
Okay.
that are considered valid under the truth functional account
Okay.
actually fail this test.
So the suppositional view
Yeah.
is actually pickier
It's more discerning. Yeah.
about what makes a good argument.
Exactly.
Okay, so can you give me an example?
Sure. Remember how we were talking about
Yeah.
how strange it sounds to say, if you dip this match in water and strike it, then it will light.
Right.
Even though we believe
Yeah.
if you strike the match, then it will light.
That seems like a problem.
And the suppositional view explains why that's a problem.
Okay.
Because strengthening the antecedent
Okay.
doesn't necessarily preserve high probability.
Okay.
You might be super confident that the match will light if you just strike it,
Right.
but way less confident if you dip it in water first. So the additional information actually changes the probability.
Okay, so the suppositional view is much more sensitive
Yeah,
to those little changes in our beliefs.
it is.
And this actually leads to one of the most radical ideas
Okay,
of the suppositional view.
what's that?
It suggests that conditionals might not have truth conditions at all.
Whoa.
That's a big one.
No truth conditions.
That's a big one.
How can something have meaning if
Yeah.
it can't be true or false?
Yeah, this is really messing with me.
Well, it's a challenging idea,
Yeah.
but the main idea here
Okay.
is that a conditional judgment,
Okay.
it actually involves two propositions,
Yeah.
not just one.
Okay.
So there's the proposition we're assuming,
The antecedent.
right, and then
Yeah.
there's the proposition we're evaluating
The concept.
under that assumption.
Right.
And those don't necessarily combine to
Got it.
form a single proposition
Okay.
that's either true or false.
So it's more like a thought process.
Yeah, it's a way of reasoning
Yeah.
rather than just like a statement about the world.
Oh,
And David Lewis actually proved that conditional probabilities
Right.
can't be interpreted as probabilities of the
Yeah.
truth of some single conditional proposition.
Oh.
So if the probability of a conditional isn't inherently tied to its truth,
Oh,
the whole idea of truth conditions for conditionals
yeah.
becomes questionable.
Okay. This is a lot to think about.
It is.
But I'm kind of liking this approach.
Yeah.
It seems to fit
Yeah.
really nicely with how we think about conditionals.
Especially in uncertain situations.
Right.
Of course, not all philosophers have
Oh.
given up on the idea of truth conditions for conditionals.
Right.
There are other approaches out there.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I'm ready to hear about them.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've seen how the suppositional view challenges this whole idea of truth conditions for conditionals.
Right.
So how do other theories even try to reconcile truth? With these insights about hypothetical reasoning.
Well, one prominent attempt comes from Robert Stalnaker,
Okay.
and he uses this framework of possible worlds
Okay.
to give conditionals truth conditions, while
Okay.
also acknowledging this
Yeah.
role of context and hypothetical thinking.
Okay. Possible worlds.
Yeah, yeah,
Now we're
yeah.
getting a little bit out there.
It's a bit of a mind bender.
Just to remind everyone,
Yeah.
possible world are basically
Yeah,
ways that things could have been,
exactly.
like alternate reality.
Yeah, like alternative realities.
Okay.
So Stalnaker's theory says that
Yeah.
if A, then B is true.
Okay.
If B is true in the possible world,
Okay.
that's most similar to the actual world,
Okay.
and where A is also true.
So we're not just looking at any world where A is true. We're looking at the closest one
The closest one to ours.
to our reality.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're basically imagining a slight tweak to reality
Yeah.
where A becomes true,
Right.
and then we're checking if B is also true
In that tweaked reality.
in that reality.
Yeah.
Okay, I kind of like that.
Yeah, it's a nice way of capturing that connection
Yeah.
between the antecedent and the consequent.
Right, which is what the truth functional account was missing.
Exactly.
Oh.
And this theory actually does a good job of
Right.
getting around some of those paradoxes
yeah.
of material implication.
Okay.
And it often agrees with Adams's probability preserving account of validity.
But I'm sure there are some problems
Of course,
with this theory.
there are always problems.
because no philosophical theory is perfect.
Right.
So what are some of the issues here?
Well, one issue that the Stanford Encyclopedia points out
Okay.
is that this idea of nearness
Okay.
between possible worlds can be a bit slippery.
Right.
How do we decide which world is closest to ours?
Right, because it seems like that could be subjective.
It could be.
It could
Maybe.
depend on like all sorts of background assumptions.
Exactly, and Stalnaker recognized this.
Okay.
And he suggested that this idea of nearness can change depending on the context.
The context of the conversation.
Yeah, or the shared knowledge between the speaker and the listener.
So now it's even more complicated.
Right. The truth of the conditional
Yeah.
depends on stuff outside the statement itself.
Yeah. Okay. And then what about uncertain conditionals?
Ah, yeah, good point.
Where we're not talking about absolute truth or falsehood.
Yeah.
We're talking about degrees of belief.
How do we account for that?
Yeah.
Like Stalnaker's framework.
What if I'm like 70% confident in a conditional?
Right.
How does that fit in
That's a tough one.
with this possible worlds idea?
Yeah, and what if there are multiple nearest worlds?
Right. What if there are several
Yeah.
that are equally close?
Right. What do we do then?
Yeah.
Well, Stalnaker actually had an answer for that.
Okay.
She proposed this thing called supervaluations.
Supervaluations. Okay.
Yeah, imagine you've got a bunch of maps,
Okay.
and they're all equally reliable,
Okay.
but they disagree about whether a certain path leads to treasure. So supervaluation would say,
Yeah.
we can't be sure about the path.
Unless all the maps agree.
Exactly.
Okay.
So similarly,
Yeah.
if B is true in all the nearest worlds where A is true,
Okay.
then the conditional is true.
Okay.
If it's false in all of them,
Yep.
then it's false.
Okay.
But if there's disagreement,
Yeah.
then the conditional is indeterminate.
So we have a third truth value.
We do.
Indeterminate.
Yep.
Okay.
It's a way of dealing with those cases.
Okay. But it seems like a lot of conditionals are
Yeah.
going to end up in this indeterminate limbo.
That's true, and the Stanford Encyclopedia highlights that as a potential problem.
Yeah, we don't like a lack of answers.
Philosophers don't like indeterminacy.
No.
We want things to be true or false.
Right.
So even Stalnaker's view
Yeah.
doesn't completely solve the puzzle.
Are there any other attempts?
Well, there's one more worth mentioning.
Okay.
It's from Frank Jackson,
Okay.
and he actually sticks with the truth functional account.
Okay, so he thinks
Yeah.
if A, then B really does mean
Yeah,
not A or B.
exactly. But he adds a twist.
Okay.
He says there's a special rule
Okay.
about when it's appropriate to assert a conditional.
So it's not just about the truth conditions.
Right. There's this extra layer of meaning
Okay.
that goes beyond truth.
Interesting.
Yeah, he compares it to words like but or even.
Okay.
So, for example,
Right.
A but B has the same truth conditions as A and B,
Okay.
but it conveys the sense of contrast or surprise.
Right, like
Those
those two things shouldn't both be true?
exactly.
But they are.
Right.
Okay.
So similarly, he says asserting if A then B
Okay.
does more than just expressing belief in not A or B.
Yeah.
It also signals that you wouldn't give up that belief,
Okay.
even if you learn that A was true.
So it's like saying,
Yeah.
I really believe this.
I'm committed to this,
Yeah.
even if A turns out to be true. But even with this idea,
Yeah.
Jackson's theory runs into problems. The Stanford Encyclopedia points out that there's not much evidence
Okay.
that people actually use conditionals this way.
Okay.
And his theory doesn't really help us with those compounds.
Right. Those pesky compounds.
Yeah, that problem keeps coming up.
So maybe we need to just rethink
Yeah.
our whole approach to conditionals.
Maybe they're not just propositions
Yeah.
with simple truth conditions.
Yeah, this has been a very thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
You know, we've seen how even something as simple as an if-then statement
Yeah.
can lead to these really deep philosophical questions
About how we reason,
about how we reason,
how we communicate,
how we communicate.
how we understand the world.
Yeah, and there's no easy answer.
Oh.
But, you know, I think this deep dive has given us
Yeah.
some really interesting tools
Absolutely.
to think about these questions.
It's a reminder that philosophy is about asking the right questions.
Right.
Not always about finding the answers.
What's the questions
It's are
of it?
important.
And for you, our listener,
Yep.
which theory resonates most with you?
What other approaches are out there?
What other questions do you have?
Keep thinking about it.
Keep diving deep
And we'll see you next time.
on the deep dive.